Hi, everyone. So, this previous semester, while I was teaching, they came out with a new version of Lightroom, which now includes a new color grading. Instead of just having the ability to be able to affect highlights and shadows, you can now affect midtones, and there's a little bit more control as well. So your previous old presets, your old way of doing duotones will still be the same. Nothing's going to change on previous images. Your presets will work perfectly. But now, as you move forward, you can really start affecting the midtones. And so what I wanted to do here is really be able to see where in the image the highlights was getting affected, where in the image the shadows and the midtones were getting affected. And I had a hard time doing that with an image. So I thought I would go into Photoshop. I built this gradient in 5% increments between the shadow all the way up to the highlights, so from 0 to 100. To be able to apply color to each of the areas. The next thing I considered is, well, I want to be able to use a triadic color scheme, or as close to one as possible, so I can see a separation between the three. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the shadows, and I'm just going to apply a blue. And you'll notice you can see it's in the shadows, and it slowly ekes into the midtones and even partially goes up into the highlights. And that's because of the blending slider. By default, the blending is set to 50. If I bring it down to 0, it will affect more of the shadows and less of the midtones and the highlights. It'll be less of a transition between those. There is still a transition, as you can see. So it's not like it gets rid of, the blending completely by moving it down to 0. Just a little less. Just as if I go all the way up to 100, it basically affects the shadows, midtones, and all the way up into the highlights. So for now, I'm going to just go ahead and set this to 0 so we can see as much as possible without it blending. I'm going to go up to the midtones. I'm going to add in the green. And I'm going to go to the highlights and add in the red. And you can see as it goes from one to the other how it's transitioning from that blue to the green to that red up into the whites. And so by default, remember the blending is set to 50, so you can see the midtones are really getting overrun by the shadows and the highlights. And so I recommend when you're first touching up an image and using color grading, I would actually go to blending to 0, and then I would start to introduce some of that blending so that you can really kind of finesse it. So I have found just by doing this exercise that starting at blending at 0 has been helpful for me to really understand how the shadows, midtones, and the highlights are getting affected. The next thing is what is this balance slider actually doing? When I was doing it on an image, I kind of understood, but I couldn't put my fingers on it. And so now that I have 3 separate colors here, and it's not in an image, it's very distinct, I can now see what happens when I move the balance slider to -100. You're telling Lightroom that you want to see more of the pixels be counted as shadow. So you can see that the blue is now being more in the midtones all the way up into more into the highlights, and very little bit of that red is even showing up in the highlights. Just as if I go to +100, you can now see that you're telling Lightroom that you want the pixels to be counted more towards, or more kind of like highlights. And so you can see that the red is affected in the highlights, the midtones, and even going into the shadows as it transitions into the green. In the end, what I would recommend to everybody, just so you can play around with it, open up a Photoshop document, create a gradient, some sort of increments from like 0 to 100 and 5%, 10%, something that is useful to be able to see, and then apply a triadic color scheme so you can actually see what is going on as you move the blending and then the balance to be able to see what is occurring.